Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us today. We have an amazing group of panelists, John Jay College alumni, faculty, and students who are going to bring to you this amazing conversation that I had never really put together, and I think it's going to be really valuable. So with that said, I do want to introduce the person who conceptualized the topic and the event, and she will also be our moderator this evening, and that is Jenny Horo. And I also want to publicly thank you for putting this together and being such a great partner with the alumni office to get our alumni talking to our students and talking to our young alum about their role in today's topic, artificial intelligence and human rights. So with that, I hand the mic over to you. And again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Roseanne, for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to stay engaged with the John Jay community. And thank you so much to the dear panelists for accepting the invitation of joining us in this progressive discussion around artificial intelligence and how is that affecting human rights nowadays. Thank you for everyone who has decided to join us this afternoon and learn more about the data sensitivity, machine learning, and how is artificial intelligence affecting human rights. In the name of the Office of Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving, I would like to thank you. And without any further ado, I will just say a few things about myself. I'm a human rights advocate based in New York. I'm also a proud alumni of John Jay. I received my master's in human rights in 2020. My area of research is gender-based violence and women's issues domestically and internationally. I have the pleasure to introduce you to one of our panelists tonight, Sarah Chu. Sarah is a fourth-year doctoral student in the criminal justice program at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, CUNY Graduate Center, where her research interests include the oversight and critical examination of forensic science and police surveillance technology. She is recently the senior advisor on forensic science policy at the Innocence Project, where she leads policy work that focuses on improving the valid, reliable, and just application of forensic science and police investigative technology. Sarah graduated from the University of California, San Diego, with a bachelor's degree in biochemistry and cell biology, as well as a master's in biology from the Stanford University. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Jenny. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Professor Hunter Johnson. Professor Hunter Johnson holds a PhD in mathematical logic, focusing on the complexity of representations for concepts for formal processes such as machine learning. Recently, he has applied the machine learning to problems in forensics and biology, as well as some theoretical areas in logic and mathematics. Since 2021, Professor Hunter Johnson has directed the machine learning seminar in the mathematics and computer science department. Professor Johnson, thank you so much for accepting the invite, as I know you're very busy, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. And last but not least, Professor Adam Wands. He's a part of John Jay faculty, as well as the Vice Chair for Technology of the Department of Public Management at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. His primary research interests include technology, law, and policy, information security, academic technology, and crime data. He has worked on sponsored research for or in partnership with the Federal Bureau of Investigation the National Institute of Justice, Interpol, the United Nations, as well as many educational institutions from around the world. Professor Adam, thank you so much for accepting the invite. I also know that you're very busy and constantly traveling, so I can't thank you enough for joining us tonight.
You know, as a double alumni of John Jay and a faculty member, it's an honor to have been asked to this session, so thank you.
Of course, we're honored to have you here. Before we dive into artificial intelligence and how is that affecting human rights, for everyone who's going to watch the video, the recording, or for everyone who is watching us live right now, I would like to say a couple of words about the introduction of human rights. Human rights are rights inherited to all human beings, without or regardless of race, sex, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Everyone is entitled to these human rights without discrimination. The most fundamental document of human rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that emerged in 1948. And out of the 56 member states of the United Nations at the time, 8 of them did not vote in favor of equal human rights. Since then, though, we must say that international human rights have made monumental progress. However, this does not mean that there's also violations happening constantly towards human rights. The development of human rights, it's not a linear process, especially in the last 2 decades. The last 2 decades have shown human rights advancement have remained stagnant or declined in some parts of the world, unfortunately, and they're not static. They change over time, and so do the violations. We know that the old wave of violations of human rights may include armed conflict, war, the use and the abuse of death penalty, but we also have the new age of violations of human rights, and that includes data machine learning, the use and the abuse of artificial intelligence, which is what we're going to be talking about in the next hour. And we must say that as artificial intelligence continues to find its way in our daily lives, its propensity to interfere with human rights only gets more severe. So how do human rights look like in the age of artificial intelligence? I believe that we all can agree with the fact that the potential of artificial intelligence to both help and harm people, it's nowadays much greater than from it was before. And while we have already seen some of the consequences, the impacts will continue to grow in its scope and in its severity. However, by starting now to examine what safeguards and what structures are necessary to address the problems and abuses, the worst harms, including those that disproportionately impact marginalized people, can be in the future mitigated and prevented. So I know I said a lot in regards to artificial intelligence and human rights. So I would start, Professor Adam, with a question that might sound very general, but I do think that it's necessary to go over. When speaking of the impact of artificial intelligence in teaching public administration, how do we establish an acceptable level of autonomy for AI? You're on mute, Professor.
Yeah, I know, the mute thing. I think when it comes to autonomy and teaching of public administration, I think that AI, I think there's 2 questions here. I think one question is, how does or will AI affect teaching of public administration and the field of public administration? And then I also see more of an ethical question about levels of autonomy, having to do with when we feel, at what thresholds do we feel more comfortable letting AI do more decision making for us. Let me answer the first one, which I think is exciting. But before I answer the question, I want to say, when I was younger, I never really knew or cared too much about human rights. And then I was a John Jay undergraduate student, and I took a course on human rights at John Jay with Professor George Andropoulos, who is still at the college. And it was a real mind-opening experience to me. And that mixed with my legal education and ethics. You're going to hear me talk about ethics a lot tonight, because I think ethics is the prime guide to get us to the right place without problems. When it comes to public administration, I think when we're teaching public administration, first and foremost, I can envision a day where college admissions are handled by AI systems instead of committees. So let's start with that. Students who apply to graduate programs, and once we get it right, it will be fair, it will be less racially or gender-based discrimination. But I think the beginning is students who are applying to programs, any sort of graduate or undergraduate programs, having AI systems be able to vet them and choose the best candidate. I think that's coming down the pike in a number of years. And I think that it will drastically benefit education to take bias, human bias, out of the equation of who gets into what programs. But when it comes to actually teaching it in public administration or criminal justice, I think that what really needs to be understood is the important core of ethics that AI has to be developed around. Yes, we will have computers making decisions based on our training those computers. But I think that the rules involving the training of the computers and telling the computers what is good and what is bad, I think that that ultimately comes down to human rights and ethics and our humanity of who we are. So I could see these things being very important in courses in technology for public management or administration, but more importantly for ethics at all levels. Making sure that these models are trained in ways that are ethical and represent the best of humanity, not the worst.
Thank you. That was very insightful, and thank you for sharing with us the experience of your initial knowledge of human rights. It was I myself, when I was going to school at John Jay for my bachelor's in international criminal justice, I did have little to no knowledge about human rights internationally and domestically. And yes, I also took a course with Professor Andreopoulos, and it was so important. It put an emphasis on ethics, not for artificial intelligence specifically, but for ethics that could be applied in every field. So thank you for sharing that. My next question is for Professor Johnson. Professor Johnson, as human rights defenders, including here myself, we all need to make the distinction between beneficial AI and harmful automated decision-making processes. When I personally think of machine learning gone wrong, I think of facial recognition. That's the first thing that comes in mind, and its violations. I would like to hear your insight and your take on this issue.
So I can see why you would think first of facial recognition, because this, serious challenge presented by facial recognition is that it can be used to curtail the right of assembly, which it obviously is very important for human rights if you want to change the governmental situation. And in a certain political configuration, you're going to need to mount a protest. And unfortunately, it's the case now that if people do assemble publicly, a couple of CCTV cameras and an algorithm can automatically open FBI files on people at scale. In the United States, we have to worry about our own government as United States citizens. But in China, with the Hong Kong protests, you saw people actually disguising their faces on the way to protests a couple summers ago. It's hard for them to take public transit in a way that isn't traceable. And in a case like that, with a regime that isn't as benign as the United States is now in that regard, it could actually be really scary. Then it becomes like an act of heroism, whereas before they would have been more or less anonymous. And so I do think that could have a real chilling effect. I know you're also interested in gender-based violence, and I think there's also a super creep potential here, because you might know that some of these companies that have large databases of information that allow you to do facial recognition, like Facebook is obviously one, and there's another that's escaping me, but that got into the wild a couple of years ago, and people had these apps that would allow you to take a photo of a person at a party, and it would recognize their face, and it would instantly bring up sort of personal information about them. And you can almost see like Terminator vision with like Google Glass walking down the street, like total privacy invasion. And I think that has a lot of negative potential for stalking and things like that. There are, in some ways, the cell phone is a worse invasion of privacy. Credit cards, banking, a lot of big corporations. Like we don't really care about financial privacy. Everybody knows about the way we spend our money. They potentially know where we go. We carry around a microphone and a camera at all times in our pockets. But there's something particularly disgusting about facial recognition, I guess, in some cases, because it is us, But in London, they have CCTV cameras everywhere. I think there is so now I'm trying to argue against myself. Like there must be beneficial applications of facial recognition as well. So you can get crime reduction, I assume, but there's obviously the potential for abuse of power. So it's a trade-off.
It is indeed, and there's just like any other concept, AI does have its positive and its negative side, and the concern nowadays is that we're not responsible for fully investigating the negative side of AI because it's so easy accessible to see and admire its positive sides that we're almost blind or not interested to dive deeper into the research of why is it harmful. Thank you. My next question is for Sarah. Sarah, let's talk a little bit about surveillance and predictive policing through artificial intelligence. You are currently the senior advisor on forensic science policy at the Innocence Project, where you lead policy work that focuses on improving applications of forensic science and police investigative technologies. Tell us a little bit about the effective steps taken on this matter.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'll start off by saying that I'm here today in my personal capacity because I did want to talk a little bit about some of the scholarship that I've been working on that is separate from my work at the Innocence Project, but I'm happy to talk about that work as well. So at the Innocence Project, in my work, we started off really focusing on forensic science, and we've only recently started wading into the issues of surveillance technology. And in our work on forensic science, the primary issue that we had been focused on was accuracy and reliability. And what we learned as time passed and as DNA technologies advance, that these advancements in DNA technology were raising different questions. So it was no longer, is it accurate and reliable? We had to think about who it was collecting data from, whether that was happening disproportionately, and whether that was creating different harms in the system. And in genetics, there is a study area called ELSI, so that's ethical, legal, and social implications. And it was an area of research that was initially funded when the Human Genome Project was initiated. And the idea was, we knew that the Human Genome Project was going to be expansive in the kind of genetic data it was going to be able to produce. And so NIH had the wherewithal and the foresight to invest in researchers that would be following these technologies, would be trained in bioethics, and would, alongside these technologies, be able to help society understand their impact and then contain them if they were going to be harmful. And we just haven't had the same kind of formalized system for other forensic methods, for surveillance technologies. And we're really seeing the issues that are being generated. And at the Innocence Project, where we find ourselves really thinking about impact in the criminal legal system is on a phenomenon that we call suspect development. It was a term coined by my colleague Rebecca Brown, who's our policy director, and that is when AI systems that can throw a wide net can capture innocent people in the course of investigations. And we could go on forever about how investigative evidence doesn't have to undergo the same kind of challenges that forensic evidence going to court does. But in becoming a suspect, that innocent people, because of the way that technology is implemented, because it's happening within the context of the American policing system, that once someone becomes a suspect, and tunnel vision sets in the investigation, that there could be all sorts of exculpatory evidence that pops up down through the investigation, but they get dismissed because of cognitive biases. And we've seen that happen in our cases. We've had clients who were in completely different states, weren't even present, because they were demonstrated to be elsewhere and still convicted of crimes. We have, in a study that was done of the first 325 DNA exonerations, 28 of those innocent people had exculpatory DNA at pretrial. So they should never have gone to trial. They should never have been convicted. False confessions should never have been extracted from them because the evidence was already there. But somehow exculpatory evidence gets dismissed, and it's this human interaction with the AI technology. And so it's we will be coming to a point, as Professor Want said, that the technologies that are being developed now are going to be better, and they're going to get really good at what they do. But at the end of the day, there's still a component of it where decision has to be made by humans in the social context. And we really have to think about that and evaluate that, because I think that there's a technology is often seen as, oh, this is going to be objective, it's going to be a fast solution, and then we can just rely on it, and that's it. And the truth is that it's only one tiny slice of the entire decision-making process. And so I think that my colleagues here on the panel are telling us that that we really need to think about the whole picture.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I was on mute, but I was constantly saying right to all of the informative things that you were saying. So thank you. And you're kind of leading to this next question. And Professor Adam, I'm going to come back at you with your take on the quote unquote routine use of previously collected data for somewhat related purposes. What direction should we go? Should we give more discretion to public or private agencies, or should we move towards having more federal rules and regulations set in place when it comes to AI?
Great question this is, and I think it's right in the area I'm interested in, data collection, public data collection. A lot of my research involves exactly that. And I think the answer to all of your questions is yes, which might seem weird because the questions seem that they are counter questions, right? You gave me what seemed like a weighted question. Do we do A or B? And I'm saying we do both. Transparency is critical and the most important thing when it comes to the use of data. So yes, we need federal legislation that gives us transparency and sets rules as to what could be used and what can't be used, and how, most important, how long data is retained for, right? Data retention is one of the most important elements of the entire equation. Some data that's collected by law enforcement, even like license plate readers in New York City, that data are kept forever at this point. At least the last time I looked at it, which was 2 years ago. So we do need legislation, federal, state legislation that sets very specific guidelines as to what could be used, what can't be used, how long data could be retained. However, I also firmly believe that we need to give our law enforcement officers and officials tools to do their jobs. So I'm a firm believer that if data is out there, that will help, especially solving specific crimes. The way I look at this, it kind of bifurcates. There's general surveillance on the mass population, but then there's using specific data sets and data points to solve specific crimes. And going back to what Professor Johnson said before about facial recognition, yeah, it's really scary when facial recognition watches a large net of people and is making lists of everybody going to a political protest or a political rally. And I am very against using facial recognition in those cases. But where it's good is when somebody walks into a subway with a bomb, which happened in downtown Manhattan a couple of years ago, a pressure cooker bomb, right? And he left the pressure cooker bomb in the subways. And before we even were able to get news reports on this, the Department of Homeland Security was able to identify who the suspect was based off of the picture of him going through the turnstile. And so was the NYPD. Kudos to both of them for amazing investigative work. So I think that we need transparency, we need ethics, we need rules, but we need to give our law enforcement tools that they could use to solve specific crimes without casting too large of a net and putting us under a surveillance society.
Thank you for that. You all are triggering more questions for me, but Professor Johnson, I'm going to come back with machine learning as being a somehow lucrative industry nowadays. Many healthcare, finance, and business venture hire machine learning engineers to increase the productivity along the data. So understanding the rules and regulations around data machine learning and its productivity, it's one thing, and researching good and bad AI, it's one thing. How do you draw the border of teaching good and bad AI to college students?
Kathy O'Neill wrote a really great book called Weapons of Math Destruction that attempts to sort of axiomatically characterize the misuse of machine learning. And it involves things like transparency and in certain extremely powerful systems like the compass system for determining whether or not a person should be paroled, basically there's potential for like pernicious feedback loops. So transparency, pernicious feedback loops. Often machine learning is applied in situations where people don't know it's being applied to them. Like as an example, you might call a call center and be put on hold, and unbeknownst to you, the period of time you wait is a function of some prediction that company has as to how much money you're likely to spend, or something like that. Also, the outcomes are often there aren't incentives to follow up on the outcomes of the applications of these systems. The real world applications, like how do they match up against like human values, so there's another one that I'm forgetting. But just thinking about like about training people to be ethical. So they should look out for situations like that. But unfortunately, that's going to describe a lot of the potential jobs that are available to them. Because if you're working for a private company, then they have an interest in keeping the source code proprietary, and things like that. And so the ethical standards that exist in older occupational traditions, like being a doctor or a lawyer or a financial advisor, there's such a thing as a fiduciary. And those ethical traditions, I think, don't bode well, because the obligations of a fiduciary are basically to represent the best interests of their client. And often people who work in the corporate world, their ultimate ethical obligation is often quoted as being to the shareholder. So in these ethical standards are not the same as value standards or moral standards. And often, when they do get established, they make real world compromises, and they're kind of, it's not about what's right and wrong, it's about the standard practice. And so it'll be interesting to see how that develops as time goes on, because the people who design these systems, they do have considerable power. Like the application of a rule about whether or not somebody gets out of jail, that's less like a lawyer arguing for the applicability or non-applicability of a law, and more like somebody actually making a law. And so there should be it should tap into the system that our society has for putting values or matching our values against societal outcomes, which people don't like politics, but politics is basically how we address those questions. And so that has to be put into that system somehow, I think.
Thank you. And it brings me back to September of 2021, when the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, warned all of us that AI can pose a serious threat towards human rights, and where maybe we're not well equipped to face everything that's coming. And maybe Sarah, you can tell us a little bit about what do you think on this topic, as far as should the higher the risks, the stricter the requirements for the use of artificial intelligence? Is it currently being enough considering these current risks? Is there anything that academics can do in order to one, raise awareness, but two, you take efficient steps towards solving the issue per se?
So I think that the declaration by the UN Commissioner on Human Rights was amazing, and she called for a moratorium on AI technologies until we have a better assessment of the risk. And I think everyone would agree that the greater the risk, that there should be a proportionate level of protections. But I think that where it becomes difficult and in practical policy implementation is that who defines risk? Who defines what's beneficial? And if you're on one side of the adversarial system, you'll define it very differently from someone on the other side. And so this ties into what Professor Johnson was talking about with values and morals. And we can't establish those unless we have some sort of normative conversation about a conversation about establishing our normative values around privacy and impact. So an important part of the work that I do is thinking through the justice and equity impacts of technologies. Right now, we don't really have very good measures for justice and equity and much research on how technologies may have disparate racial impacts. And so not being able to measure it also makes it difficult to assess what that risk is. With Professor Frank Pizzella at John Jay and an amazing colleague in the CJ PhD program named Justice Evans, we recently put together a paper on what we're calling surveillance load. So that is the kind of the special burden borne by particularly communities of color in terms of the amount of data and surveillance that's put on them and data that's extracted from them. And when we talk about technology, we often think about them one piece at a time, one tech at a time. But the reality is that at any given time, there are many AI technologies all layered on top of each other. And some of us experience more surveillance than others. And so we need research that's looking at the interaction of all of these technologies. And what does it mean when you're someone who is whose neighborhood is considered high risk in CompStat, and there's more cameras per capita in your neighborhood, and you're in a gang database, and your DNA is being taken surreptitiously, that this weight of surveillance is something that we should be thinking about academically through scholarship, and in order to prepare policymakers for what they should be doing. And so I think that assessing those guardrails that Professor Want was talking about, and how we can make sure that law enforcement has what they need to ensure public safety, but at the same time meet the moral and ethical standards of our communities, requires a conversation that integrates everyone in the system, including affected communities. And I think that is so important, because usually the people at the table are policymakers maybe, but primarily law enforcement, because they're the users of these technologies. And so having impacted communities at the table is incredibly important, and something that's beginning to happen in certain communities across the country, but is by no means a standardized practice in how we determine what technologies we're going to use.
Thank you. Professor Adam, you said in the beginning of the session that you're gonna be talking a lot about ethics, and I'm gonna dive right into it and ask you a somewhat ethical question. One of the cornerstones of administrative decision making is a due process that ensures fairness and non-discrimination. And while for the sake of being cost-effective, programmers that developed AI system approach the program with from an angle of efficiency, they may very well fail to keep in consideration the broader ethical considerations behind the use of the AI systems that they develop. How do we avoid this? So you have answered this question already by saying that, yes, we need federal rules and regulations in place to avoid this from happening. But how do we get into the specifics of every case to make sure that fairness and non-discrimination is applied.
You know, if you have a automated AI vehicle driving down the road and it gets into a situation where it needs to make a decision as to whether hit into a parked car or a pedestrian, the AI system needs to be able to judge correctly and cause the minimum amount of damage. And if we're only relying on programmers or engineers to make those decisions, the minimum amount of damage might be financial damage, or it might be legal risk damage, or it might be don't crash one Tesla into another damage. Go for the Honda. And I think the way we avoid this, or at least mitigate, we don't avoid, but we mitigate, is we need to realize that, yes, engineers and software developers will very often be taking their easy way out from a financial point of view. And I think the way we address this and fix this, and I alluded to earlier, is with teams of software engineers and developers sitting with ethical experts, sitting with legal experts, sitting with administrators. Sarah talked a little bit about getting to a consensus of normative values. And I think that the way we mitigate this exact issue of broader programmatic use of AI systems and how do we keep them fair and non-discriminatory, I think that the engineers aren't the ones who are making the decisions whether to tell the AI if it's right or wrong. Instead, committees, let's call it a committee, or groups of people who are able to look at different scenarios and come to some normative conclusions. Yeah, you might hit the parked car instead of hitting the pedestrian. And I think, 9 out of 10 people in a room might agree with that. And that's the way the AI is modeled and trained. So I think that we need to be very careful in the future. Now and in the future, I think we need to be very careful. And I think that we need to put into place these systems and values so that the correct people are teaching the AI whether their decisions are good or bad. Because let's face it, there have been too many really scary movies where we've gotten this wrong. And in almost every major movie, AI, if it's there, it's going to be evil. So I think as a human race, we are concerned, and we're doubtful that we're going to get this right. Whether it's Skynet, there's just a bunch of different AI systems across pop literature, and it's never gotten right ever. So I think now's the time to sit down and develop groups of people who could train these models correctly, because whether or not we like it, this is the future of decision making. And I think if we do get it right, we'll have a fairer society.
And I hope we do it right. And this is exactly my inspiration for even putting this together, because as you said, there's been many scary movies, and you see many scary movies gone wrong, and you start believing that that's exactly what's going to happen if you don't take the right measurement or implement preventive strategies from those movies to happen. Thank you. Professor Johnson, coming back at you with a question that ties up to what Professor Adams said in regards to transparency and diversity and fairness when machine learning programs are being used. Should we point fingers at the private businesses that profit out of the machine learning programs that are being used? Should we point fingers at the government? Should there be a joint effort? And if financial motivations are behind, who are we pointing fingers at? How do we get past that, since we're talking about an ethical issue?
So this is just kind of my personal feelings.
Yeah.
I think in certain contexts, it's absolutely clear that the private business is responsible, and in some cases, people should have broad leeway with what to do with their business. But then you have problems when in two situations. One is when you get in a monopolistic kind of configuration like Facebook and Twitter, and that's sort of a debate that we're having now nationally. And another is when you have government contractors, like recently, I don't know if you noticed this, but for a time being recently, in order to log on to the IRS website, you had to move your face around and show your face and do like a little bioinformatic thing. And so the company that was responsible for handling that data was a private contractor. Private contractors write these programs, like in the Compass incident about, this is a famous case of an AI system that was supposed to determine whether or not a person would recidivate if they were released early from jail. And this is like the, machine learning gone wrong, case in point, like a classic example. When AI systems are doing things that would otherwise be done by a government official or some member of a government bureaucracy, or in other cases where companies have such a monopolistic control of a certain industry that they're functionally like utilities, then there's definitely a place for regulation and in contexts like that.
Thank you. But we're close to the ending, so I have a general question to get your opinion on how to go about this issue, and that ties up with almost everything that we've spoken about so far. Sarah, one of the human rights mostly affected, amongst many, but specifically the right to privacy, is something that it's very easily affected by artificial intelligence. What could be some of the safeguard practices to avoid compromising privacy as much as privacy has been compromised already? And I would like to stay hopeful, but it doesn't seem like we're going in a good direction when it comes to compromising privacy either.
So to echo my co-panelists, that we really do need regulation and federal rules or the passage of federal laws that are looking at the system as a whole and establishing the boundaries of what we can do with these technologies and how they're acquired and what needs to be known before they're implemented. And in police investigations, there are no rules. So unless policymakers make them, and so there isn't a sufficiency standard for how accurate a technology needs to be before it's implemented. Facial recognition is a great example. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, did a well-known study that showed that the vast majority of facial recognition technologies were disproportionately had higher, that these technologies had higher false positives for people of color and for women and for the young and the old. And these were technologies already in use. And currently there are no studies of the operational implementation of facial recognition. So that means, when it's being used by law enforcement in the American criminal legal system, that we don't know what that looks like. And so you could have the most accurate technology, but if it's not being used in a way that honors safeguards, or agencies putting safeguards on their own, we're kind of signing on to the societal experiment. And so among the protections that we could be thinking of is ensuring that there's a warrant requirement for different types of use, limiting the types of crimes for which they're used, that the invasion of privacy, we may as a society be willing to do it for terrorist events, but not for someone stealing a pack of gum. And again, having that societal conversation. I co-authored a book chapter with Dr. Eric Pisa at John Jay and Dr. Brandon Welsh from Northeastern University on community technology oversight boards. So these are boards that could be implemented using community members. So this wouldn't be like federal, big federal regulation, but this would be local or maybe state level oversight, where you would be bringing together what we call the Trinity: practitioners, researchers, and community stakeholders that must include impacted communities to look at the public safety problem, determine if you even need technology to solve it. Because sometimes technology is kind of the third or fourth most effective thing to do in that situation. So determine if you even need technology to solve it. And if you do, to have these people working collectively to track its implementation, design implementation policies that honor the justice and equity concerns that we have as a society, and be willing to pull it back if it's causing harm. And so this is not exactly like the committees that Professor Want was talking about, because this is downstream. He's talking about really important upstream decisions that that impact the technologies that get released. And so, so I think that as a society, we have to take action, and we need to be thinking about these upstream and downstream opportunities to cabin how we use these technologies, and to ensure that, as you were saying, that we find ways to use them for the benefit of humankind, and not be in a position where 20 years later, 5 years later, or the next Too True to Be Comfortable blockbuster movie comes out that lays out the scary surveillance society that could result if we don't do the hard work now.
Totally. And thank you for sharing. It's good to hear that it's work being done, and I look forward to developing this issue more and more. Professor Adam, to wrap up, in the current state of the justice evolution as we stand today, is AI giving us more trouble or serving the greater good in the name of efficiency? Or 50-50?
So, it's if I put a number on it, I'd be wrong. Let me respond to something that Sarah said, and it actually wraps a lot of this together. One of my graduate courses that I teach in public administration has to do with computer security and investigations, and I start the class with a statement. I tell the students that the traditional notion of privacy is a myth. It no longer exists in any way, shape, or form. Privacy has been disposed of, and one of the reasons Dr. Johnson brought up, is our cell phones that we carry around. But there are many, many, many more reasons. There's there's a comment on our chat about work surveillance capitalism, and the incredible data that's being collected in order to support capitalism and shopping and marketing and everything else. But when it comes to criminal justice, getting back to your question, I think that we have to accept the fact that we are approaching a time in humanity where some people call it the singularity, for example. We're approaching a time in humanity where computers are going to be running the show, sort to say. And I don't want to look at whether it's good or bad in criminal justice. I don't want to say is it more trouble than it's serving, because it's not. But what we have to understand is that we are developing the future of humanity and the criminal justice system right now through our everyday development of our computers, technology, investigative software, AI, machine learning, and more importantly, the education and training of those coming into law enforcement and government right now who will be in senior positions that need to make really important decisions in the very near future. So is it worth more trouble than it's giving? No, it's not. But we need to all understand, and there have been several cases across the country where this happens, when the AI facial recognition system says your suspect is John X, and here's his address, we all need to understand you don't just go and arrest John X because the computer told you it was him. And we've seen cases all over the country where that exact fact pattern has happened. Luckily not in New York City. I think the NYPD, I know the NYPD has really good protocols where no one's arrested just on a facial recognition hit. An investigation, a proper investigation will be done. And it doesn't mean they get it right 100% of the time, but at least they understand that just because it says John X doesn't mean that he's the actual person that appeared in the video. I have a better vision of the future than most writers for Hollywood. And I think that through forums like this, and Jenny, thank you for putting this together and sponsoring it. I think through forums like this and through people who are a lot smarter and more dedicated than I am in the future, I really think that we will get this to a place where it makes better decisions than me or you.
Totally. And it's interesting how we all go in circle and mention facial recognition, because that's the most disturbing one that we've seen so far. So I think it's worth talking about it, and it's worth having a conversation to then go figure out what measurements can we put in place, not only for the NYPD, for the whole country, about how to go about it. And yes, I agree that if we get it right now, we're going to move towards a better future and not be one of those producers in Hollywood that, put together all types of sorts of things in regards to artificial intelligence. But I do think that as of we stand right now, I hope that we can all agree about the fact that there's more research that needs to be done in the field. I do think, and please tell me if you don't agree, that not much is being done in the field. There's much more that could be done. And well, I see Roseanne that is putting in the chat that maybe we should have a part 2, and I hope to have a part 2, and I hope you're all on board for a part 2. I
would certainly be happy to do a part 2, but I also want to say, even when it comes to facial recognition, that there is a lot being done. I reject the notion that not much is being done. And instead, I postulate that the correct entities in the United States whose job it is to police new technologies, such as Centers for Human Rights, Centers for Justice, academics, scholars, reporters, investigative journalists, and even responsible law enforcement leadership, I do see them taking action, and I do see them wanting better outcomes than we have now. But a part 2 would be great.
Thank you. I lost track of the Q&A, but I see a lot of comments. I don't particularly see a question. So I can't thank you enough for dedicating your afternoons to this conversation around artificial intelligence and human rights. And thank you. I will stay in touch for a potential part 2. But in the meantime, please have a wonderful evening. Thank you again for joining, and thank you for all of the attendees for coming as well. Roseanne, any closing remarks?
Yeah, well, first, that was amazing. I am a learner, and this is the first time I've ever been in a conversation like this, of this nature, of this topic. So I'm grateful because I learned so many new things today. And I would want to, in the part 2, talk about facial recognition, but also have the conversation about making sure that the pipeline in the industry is diverse, because diverse employees and scientists and mathematicians will ask different questions of the software, making it perhaps mitigating perhaps some of what we've been discussing here. So I'm on it. We'll get it done. I do want to invite all of you to future events that we are having. I will put the link in the chat to our calendar. I want to give special attention to an event we're having for Black History Month. At the end of the month, we're going to be talking about Black voices in law enforcement. And Benjamin Tucker, who is retired first deputy commissioner, I hope I got that right, of the NYPD, who's also an alum of the college, will be moderating that discussion. And I also want to highlight that we're going to have an event for Women's History Month entitled Black and Latina Women in the Law, where we're going to have judges and lawyers who identify as such, doing somewhat of a panel discussion. But then the second half is really going to be breakout rooms where they'll do small mentorship tables of sorts, mentorship tables. So please, I just put the link in the chat with all of this information. It's just one flyer, and you can just click on the RSVP for the event that you're interested in. But I'm on it. I will get us a part 2, maybe in the fall. And I am so grateful to all of you who are in attendance, and to all of our illustrious panelists. It was a pleasure to meet you, and a pleasure to really listen and become a neophyte in this conversation. I just want to learn so much more, and I'm going to pay more attention as a result. So thank you everyone for being here. Have a wonderful evening. And it's still early enough in the semester for me to say have a wonderful semester. Much success. Take good care, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.